Dan Tehan, thanks for your time. The advice seems to be evolving pretty quickly. So what's the official advice now for the novel coronavirus for students and for schools?
So that advice hasn't changed. The advice is if you've been in contact with someone who has the virus or are showing flu-like symptoms or symptoms which mean that you might have the virus, you should stay away from school. And that's the same advice that we've been providing to schools, to childcare centres, vocational education providers, universities for the last 4 or 5 days.
Does that differ at all for schools and so on in the general population? Is there anything specific for advice for them?
No, so the advice for schools has remained consistent with that's been given to the general population.
Right.
And we must understand that this advice is coming from leading medical experts here in Australia and also from the World Health Organisation, so leading medical experts internationally. And what the government has said is we will continue to take that advice. If there is any change to that advice, then we would immediately change the advice we're giving to parents, we're giving to schools, etc.
But shouldn't there be more of a concern or cautious approach with schools? You've got hundreds of people mingling and also some, when you're talking about younger students, pretty vulnerable people compared to grown adults.
So Tom, as I've said, we take the advice of the medical experts on this. So they're aware of the circumstances. They consider and look at these things very seriously, and they advise the government. And we've made it very clear, and Minister Hunt has done this from the outset, that we will take that medical advice as it's given to us and provide that to parents, to the community, to schools, and we will continue to do that. And it's backed and supported by leading international medical advice.
The most number of cases in New South Wales, the health minister there is asking parents to hold students back from school if they've been to China recently. So you're not on the same page there.
So what the New South Wales state government has done is taken an extra voluntary measure. So has asked parents to consider that course of action, but there was a discussion of all state medical officers with the Commonwealth Medical Officer yesterday afternoon, and everyone agreed that the current medical advice, both here nationally and internationally, is the correct advice.
So why are they going further? You're not on the same page right now as the State Health Minister.
No, it's not that I'm not on the same page.
But they're being more cautious.
Well, they've got to take into account extra considerations. They run the schools in New South Wales. Obviously, they've got to consider what feedback they would be getting from parents, what feedback they would be getting from the community.
So they're just reacting to parents' fears? Is that what you're saying?
Well, look, they have to take into a broader account of matters because they run the schools there in New South Wales. So they've taken a extra voluntary decision, which is to ask parents, to request parents in certain circumstances to keep children away from schools. That's entirely up to them to do. But what the Commonwealth has said and made it very clear that we will listen to the expert medical advice, both here and internationally, and that's what we'll continue to do.
You understand parents being a bit confused, though, when the New South Wales Health Minister is saying we're asking people not to send students to school if they've even been to China in the past month or two, and the Federal Education Minister is saying we're not going that far in a precaution.
Yeah, so what I would say to parents is that both the Australian government and the New South Wales government have endorsed the medical advice from our experts here and internationally, but what New South Wales has done is has taken an extra voluntary step. And that's entirely up to them.
You initially said there'd be consequences for any schools setting their own policies on this.
No,
is that still the case?
No, so what I was asked is what would happen if parents didn't send their children to school? And I said, well, that ultimately would be a matter for state and education ministers or state and territory governments because they're the ones who run the schools. But obviously, there can be consequences if you don't send your children to school.
But can we clarify that in any other state? So New South Wales is asking at the moment students who have even been to China not to send their kids to school. So there won't be consequences for them. What about in Victoria? If someone thinks, well, my kid's been to China, I want to take this precaution, I'm not going to send them for the next week?
Well, obviously each school will have different ways that they deal with those issues. I would imagine that most schools would use common sense in those circumstances. So
right.
There could be understanding, but there are requirements each state and territory, and they differ right across the board as to you're meant to have your children at school.
Right, of course. But right now, any other school in Australia that wants to set that policy of, for example, if a child's been to China in the past 2 months, keep them away for 2 weeks, are they free to do that now?
Well, that will depend. So the Catholic system will make decisions based on the Catholic system.
But are they free
schools,
to? You wouldn't.
Obviously the Commonwealth doesn't run schools.
No.
So state and territory governments run schools. So ultimately these are decisions.
Well, are you comfortable with them
them
setting their own policies in that
Well,
space?
what I'm very comfortable with is the way that all state and territory education ministers have coordinated what they're doing with the Commonwealth Government, have said and endorsed the advice that the Commonwealth Government is providing to them. That's been backed as recently as yesterday afternoon. We updated our advice, our Commonwealth advice at 5:05 yesterday afternoon for all education providers, whether it be childcare, whether it be state and territory governments through their education systems, whether it be universities, vocational education providers and other higher education providers. And we will continue to update that advice so that they have the latest information.
But that's okay for schools to have their own. You as Federal Minister, I understand what you say about state responsibilities, but you're comfortable with schools in this current climate saying, here's the policy we want to have on this particular virus over the next couple of weeks?
Well, for those schools that have the right and can independently make those decisions, of course they have the right to do that. For the state schools within the various jurisdictions of the state and territories, obviously that's very clearly decisions and something that education ministers at that state and territory level have to decide and act.
The reports out of China were that they believe this virus could possibly be spread when someone's not symptomatic, and Australian authorities were clarifying that. What's your advice on that?
Well, I'm not a medical expert, and so therefore you don't want me giving advice on these things. What you want me as a minister doing is taking the best medical advice here in Australia and internationally. And we have to understand that the World Health Organisation has said of the Australian government that our preparedness is second to none in the world. So I will continue to take the advice of the medical experts. Now,
what is their
advice
advice on that element of symptomatic, whether it's being able to be passed on when people are not symptomatic?
You should ask the Australian Chief Medical Officer that type of information.
Well, we spoke to the state. We've been trying to get the federal one on, but the New South Wales person essentially said, Kerry Chant, that they were working to confirm that, so they couldn't be definitive about that.
I haven't seen that interview, but what I would say...
It's a pretty crucial part of advice, though, around schools, right? If there's a possibility this is passed on when there are no symptoms, then we might have to change the way
but Tom, you're like me, you're not a medical professional, so what we need to do is listen to the medical advice that we're getting from the best. I mean, our medical experts are looking to see whether they can get a cure for the virus and are making inroads in that regard. So we have world-leading experts giving us the advice on this. So even though you and me can speculate on this, that's not our background. So what we need to do is say, let's listen to that best medical advice, both here in Australia and internationally.
But you'd be getting briefings on this.
Yes.
Have you got any latest update on when it's infectious?
I will be briefed again this morning at 9 o'clock, and so that will be updated then. But we put out a fresh advice at 5:05 yesterday afternoon to all education providers, which stated clearly there had been no change to that medical advice.
Just finally and briefly, what's the risk reward here? The risk is worst case scenario, it's spreading through schools. What's the reward through not being as cautious, that the school system goes on without too much interruption?
So all protocols around dealing with these types of pandemics is that you should take the advice of the medical experts. And so that's what the Australian government has sought to do at every step of this pandemic, and that's what we will continue to do.
I know you need to move on because a lot of people want your time this morning. Education Minister Dan Tehan, thanks for your time today.
Pleasure, Tom.